In the final 72 hours of the Battle of Vimy Ridge, April 1917, the Canadian Corps suffered 3,598 dead and 7,004 wounded whilst taking a position that had resisted French and British assault for 33 consecutive months. The casualty rate was catastrophic, the tactical success was absolute, and the prisoners taken during the actual assault numbered fewer than 400. Not because the Germans fled, not because defensive positions were abandoned, because the Canadians didn't stop. A German officer, captured 3 days after the ridge fell, would later tell his interrogators that Canadian troops moved through the trench systems like a flood, not an army. He used the word unaufhaltsam, unstoppable. His testimony, filed in British Intelligence Report 4827C on 14 April 1917, describes something closer to a natural disaster than a military operation. Positions that had held for years fell in minutes. Strong points designed to bleed attackers white were bypassed entirely, and the men defending them, dug in, supplied, and desperate, simply vanished. The Canadians didn't capture them. They went through them. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't battlefield chaos or the fog of war. It was doctrine, officially unwritten, institutionally understood, and absolutely terrifying to anyone fighting alongside them. The Western Front in 1917 was a necropolis of failed offensives. The Somme had cost the British Empire 420,000 casualties for an advance of roughly 10 kilometers. Verdun had consumed 700,000 French and German soldiers for a front that shifted barely 5 kilometers in either direction. Trench warfare had calcified into a mathematical horror. You advanced until the cost became untenable, then you stopped. Consolidation. Resupply. Another attempt. Another abattoir. Standard doctrine across every army on the Western Front followed a rhythm that was as predictable as it was suicidal. Artillery barrage to destroy wire and suppress defenders. Infantry assault in waves. First wave takes the trench. Second wave consolidates. Third wave leapfrogs forward. Fourth wave secures prisoners and wounded. By the time you'd advanced 300 meters, your attacking force had fragmented into administrative tasks: guarding, treating, signaling, resupplying. Forward momentum died the moment the first trench fell, because half your assault force was now managing what you'd just captured. The Canadian Corps, under the command of Lieutenant General Sir Arthur Currie, rejected this entirely. Currie was not a career soldier. He had been a real estate speculator and militia officer in British Columbia before the war, a man whose pre-war military experience consisted largely of weekend training camps and ceremonial parades. He had no connection to the British officer class, no allegiance to imperial military tradition, and no patience for doctrine that turned men into administrative clerks in the middle of an assault. When he took command of the Canadian Corps in June 1917, he inherited 4 divisions of men who had already spent 2 years watching British and French commanders feed soldiers into German machine guns with the methodical efficiency of an industrial process. Currie studied every failed offensive on the Western Front and arrived at a conclusion that was blindingly obvious and institutionally unthinkable: you couldn't pause. The moment you stopped to consolidate, the enemy reinforced. The moment you diverted men to guard prisoners, you lost combat power. The moment you fragmented your force into administrative packets, the assault became a siege. And sieges on the Western Front didn't end, they just accumulated corpses. So Currie designed something different, not a new tactic, a new philosophy. The Canadian assault doctrine, refined between Vimy Ridge in April 1917 and the 100 Days Offensive in 1918, rested on a principle so simple it sounded like madness: once you start moving, you don't stop. Not for wounded, not for prisoners, not for consolidation. You move until the objective is taken, or you're dead. Everything else is someone else's problem. This required rethinking the entire structure of an assault. Follow-on waves weren't there to leapfrog the first wave. They were there to handle everything the first wave ignored. Wounded were marked and left where they fell for stretcher bearers moving behind the assault. Prisoners were disarmed, pointed toward the rear, and told to walk. Strongpoints that resisted the first assault weren't reduced by siege. They were bypassed and left for follow-on units equipped specifically to collapse isolated defensive positions. The leading edge of the assault was a pure kinetic instrument. It didn't consolidate. It broke things and kept moving. To American officers observing Canadian operations during the final year of the war, this looked like controlled chaos. To British staff officers raised in the Sandhurst tradition, it looked like a court-martial waiting to happen. To the Germans facing it, it looked like something that shouldn't be possible. Lieutenant Ernst Jinger, German 73rd Hanoverian Fusiliers, wrote in his memoir, Storm of Steel, about encountering Canadian troops during the Battle of Amiens in August 1918. He describes a defense line his company had held for 11 days collapsing in under 30 minutes. Not because they were overrun, because the Canadians went around them, kept going, and left them surrounded. By the time Yinger's company retreated, the front line had moved 2 kilometers beyond their position. They weren't defeated in battle, they were left behind. The Canadians operated on the assumption that forward momentum was worth more than immediate consolidation. That 100 men moving at speed were deadlier than 500 men pausing to secure terrain. That the psychological shock of an enemy who didn't stop was a weapon in itself. And that if you moved fast enough, the administrative problem of prisoners, wounded, and bypassed strongpoints would resolve itself through sheer disorientation and collapse. This doctrine had a cost. A steep one. Canadian casualty rates during major offensives were consistently higher than British or American units operating in similar conditions. The Canadian Corps suffered approximately 60,000 casualties during the 100 Days Offensive between August and November 1918. That's roughly 20% of the entire Canadian Expeditionary Force strength at the time. The rapid advance doctrine didn't reduce losses, it compressed them into shorter, more violent periods. You took the objective faster, but you paid in blood to do it. And embedded within this doctrine was something that no official manual ever acknowledged. Something that operational reports danced around with careful euphemism. Something that German intelligence assessments stated plainly: Canadian assault troops didn't take prisoners during the actual assault. Not as policy, not as written orders, but as operational reality. The phrase "taking no prisoners" carries a moral weight that obscures the mechanical reality of what it meant in practice. This wasn't execution squads. This wasn't atrocity for its own sake. This was the logical endpoint of a doctrine that prioritized momentum above everything else. When a Canadian assault wave moved through a trench system, they had seconds to make decisions. A German soldier attempting to surrender slowed the advance. He required disarmament, searching, direction toward the rear, and at least momentary attention from men whose only job was to keep moving forward. Stopping for 10 seconds to accept a surrender could mean arriving at the next trench 30 seconds late. 30 seconds late meant the defenders had time to reposition, to man machine guns, to throw grenades. 30 seconds could cost 5 lives. So the lead assault troops made a calculation. If a German soldier threw down his weapon and raised his hands before the Canadians entered the trench, he lived. He was directed rearward and became the problem of follow-on waves. If he waited until the Canadians were inside the trench, if he attempted to surrender during close combat, if his surrender required the assault troops to stop moving, he died. Not out of cruelty, out of momentum. This created a psychological asymmetry that German units documented extensively. Canadian assaults generated panic in a way that British or American assaults did not. British troops would pause to accept surrender. American troops, particularly early in the war, often stopped entirely when encountering resistance. Canadian troops didn't. They kept coming, and the knowledge that hesitation meant death compressed German decision-making into a binary: run immediately or die fighting. A German intelligence report from September 1918, captured by British forces and translated by Field Security, stated, "Canadian assault formations do not reduce strongpoints. They envelope and isolate. Troops remaining in forward positions after Canadian passage cannot expect quarter. Withdrawal, where possible, is advised at first contact. That's not propaganda. That's operational guidance." The German General Staff was instructing its troops to retreat from Canadian assaults specifically because surrender wasn't a reliable option once the assault began. American officers found this both tactically brilliant and morally unnerving. Brigadier General Dennis Nolan, Chief Intelligence Officer of the American Expeditionary Forces, observed Canadian operations during the Meuse-Argonne Offensive in autumn 1918. His after-action report, declassified in 1974, includes a passage that encapsulates the American perspective. Canadian Corps advances with a rapidity that defies conventional consolidation. Prisoners are not secured during assault phase. This reduces administrative burden and maintains offensive pressure, but raises questions regarding consistency with established conventions. Effectiveness is undeniable. Replicability within AF structure is doubtful. Nolan was describing a force that had optimized for a variable American doctrine couldn't prioritize speed over humanity. And it worked. During the Battle of Amiens, launched 8 August 1918, the Canadian Corps advanced 12 kilometers in the first 14 hours. 12 kilometers on the Western Front, where a kilometer usually cost thousands of lives and weeks of fighting. They did it in less than a day. The German High Command would later call 8 August 1918 the Black Day of the German Army. Not because of casualties, German losses were severe, but not catastrophic. Because of collapse. Entire divisions routed, command structures disintegrated. Over 15,000 German soldiers surrendered in the first 24 hours, but the vast majority surrendered to follow-on waves, to support units, to anyone except the troops actually conducting the assault. The men at the sharp end weren't taking prisoners, they were moving. American forces operating alongside Canadian units during this period learned to adjust their own consolidation procedures. When the U.S. 33rd Division operated on the Canadian right flank during the Somme Offensive in September 1918, American staff officers were initially confused by the number of disarmed German soldiers walking rearward without guards. No escorts, no wire. Just men walking toward Allied lines with their hands visible and their weapons discarded. A liaison report from the 33rd Division dated 3 September 1918 notes, observed approx. 200 enemy personnel moving W without escort. Queried Canadian Provost. Advised this is standard procedure. Follow-on waves collect. Assault waves do not stop. This wasn't a clean process. Disarmed men walking rearward through an active battlefield sometimes got caught in artillery fire. Sometimes they picked up discarded weapons and rejoined the fight. Sometimes they simply got lost and ended up behind Canadian lines without anyone quite sure what to do with them. But from a purely operational standpoint, it worked. The assault force stayed concentrated. The momentum held, and the cost of managing prisoners fell entirely on units that weren't actively fighting. The human cost of this doctrine extended beyond casualties. Canadian assault troops operated under a psychological burden that other Allied forces largely avoided, the knowledge that hesitation could mean their death, and that mercy could mean their comrades' deaths. Every decision to accept a surrender was a gamble. Every German soldier left alive behind the advancing line was a potential threat. And the operational imperative, keep moving, don't stop, reach the objective, turned moral decisions into tactical calculations measured in seconds. Private Frederick Hodges, 58th Battalion Canadian Infantry, wrote in a letter home dated November 1918, a letter that wasn't published until 2003. "We didn't hate them. We just couldn't afford to trust them. A man with his hands up is still a man. He can lower them. We couldn't take that chance. So, we didn't." That's the operational reality beneath the doctrine. Canadian troops weren't ordered to refuse surrender. They were placed in situations where accepting surrender was tactically irrational. And when tactical rationality conflicts with moral convention, doctrine wins. American soldiers admired the results, but recoiled from the method. First Lieutenant Howard Cooper, U.S. 1st Infantry Division, attached to Canadian Corps Headquarters as a liaison officer in October 1918, wrote in his personal diary, "They fight like men who've stopped caring about the rules. Not reckless, precise. But the precision includes knowing when the rules get you killed. We can't fight like that. Our doctrine won't let us." Maybe that's why they win faster. The contrast between American and Canadian operational approaches became most visible during combined operations. American forces consolidated methodically. Canadian forces didn't. American units established clear front lines with defined defensive positions. Canadian units often didn't know where their own front line was because it kept moving. American commanders expected regular situation reports with grid coordinates and unit positions. Canadian commanders operated on a simpler metric: if you're still shooting, you haven't reached the objective yet. This created coordination nightmares. During the Canal du Nord crossing in late September 1918, American and Canadian forces advanced on parallel axes separated by roughly 1,500 meters. The American advance moved in coordinated bounds: advance, consolidate, establish fire support, advance again. The Canadian advance simply moved. By the end of the first day, the Canadian Corps was nearly 3 kilometers ahead of the American line. This created a salient, a bulge in the front that exposed Canadian flanks to enfilade fire and required American forces to rush forward to close the gap. American staff officers complained that coordinating with the Canadians was like coordinating with a cavalry charge. You couldn't predict where they'd be in 2 hours because they didn't know either. They'd be wherever forward momentum carried them. General John Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, reportedly told a group of American divisional commanders in October 1918, "The Canadians are the most effective assault force on the Western Front. Use them when you can. But don't try to copy them. Our men aren't built for it." That's not a compliment. That's an acknowledgement of fundamental incompatibility. American military culture, even in 1918, prioritized force protection, rules of engagement, and procedural adherence. Canadian assault doctrine had evolved in the opposite direction, toward accepting higher casualties in exchange for shorter battles, toward prioritizing momentum over mercy, toward a model of warfare that worked brilliantly but carried costs American commanders weren't willing to pay. The doctrine extended beyond individual combat decisions into operational planning. Canadian artillery support was designed not to destroy German positions, but to suppress them just long enough for infantry to close the distance. British and American artillery doctrine called for prolonged bombardments lasting hours or even days, attempts to obliterate defensive positions before infantry ever left the trenches. The Canadians used what they called the creeping barrage, a curtain of artillery fire that moved forward at a predetermined pace, typically 100 meters every 3 minutes, with infantry following just 50 to 75 meters behind the exploding shells. This was borderline suicidal. Men advanced so close to their own artillery that premature detonations or slight miscalculations could kill them as easily as German fire. But it worked because it gave German defenders no time to recover. The moment the shells stopped falling on a position, Canadian infantry were already inside it. There was no pause, no window for defenders to man their weapons or organize resistance. The assault wave arrived whilst the defenders were still sheltering from artillery, still disoriented, still unable to mount effective defense. Training reflected this philosophy with brutal clarity. Canadian assault troops drilled endlessly on movement under fire, on navigating trench systems at speed, on making split-second decisions about threats and targets. They trained to fight in small, self-sufficient teams that could operate independently if cut off from command. Section leaders, typically corporals or lance corporals, received authority that British and American forces reserved for officers. A Canadian section leader could redirect his squad, bypass objectives, or assault strongpoints without waiting for orders. The entire training apparatus was built around the assumption that central command would break down during an assault, that communications would fail, and that junior leaders needed the judgment and authority to keep the momentum going without guidance from above. This decentralized command structure gave Canadian units a flexibility that more rigid hierarchies couldn't match. When a Canadian platoon encountered an unexpected strongpoint, the section leaders didn't wait for orders. They assessed, decided, and acted. Some sections would fix the position with suppressive fire whilst others flanked it. Or they'd bypass it entirely and leave it for follow on units. The decision was made in seconds by men who'd been trained to value momentum above all else, who understood that stopping to reduce every strongpoint meant losing the operational tempo that made the entire doctrine work. The cost of this training was measured in months. Canadian units rotated out of the line for extensive training periods between major operations, something British and American forces rarely had the luxury to do. Between Vimy Ridge in April 1917 and Passchendaele in October 1917, the Canadian Corps spent 3 full months in training areas rehearsing assault tactics. They built replica German trench systems based on aerial reconnaissance photographs and artillery spotting reports. They practiced assaulting these replica trenches until every man knew his role instinctively, until section leaders could navigate complex trench networks in complete darkness, until the entire process of assault, consolidation, and advance became muscle memory. This level of preparation was possible because the Canadian Corps fought as a unified formation. British practice scattered divisions across different sectors and armies, moving them constantly to plug gaps and respond to crises. The Canadian government had insisted that Canadian divisions fight together as a corps, a political decision that had profound tactical consequences. It meant Canadian units trained together, fought together, and developed institutional knowledge that accumulated rather than dispersed. Lessons learned in one battle were applied in the next. Tactics that worked were refined and disseminated. Doctrine evolved through practice rather than being imposed from distant headquarters that had never seen the front. By mid-1918, the Canadian Corps had become something unique on the Western Front, an assault force that combined the tactical flexibility of elite units with the sustained combat power of a corps-sized formation. They could hit with the violence and speed of stormtroops whilst maintaining that intensity across days rather than hours. And they did it by accepting costs that other forces found institutionally unacceptable. The psychological weight of this doctrine fell heaviest on the men at the sharp end. Canadian assault troops knew they were expected to keep moving, regardless of what happened around them. Wounded comrades were left for stretcher bearers. Dead were left where they fell. Surrender attempts were ignored or suppressed because stopping meant dying. This created a kind of tunnel vision during assaults, a narrowing of awareness to the single imperative of forward movement. Veterans described it as a trance state, a condition where normal emotional responses shut down and only the objective mattered. Corporal William Metcalf, 1st Canadian Division, described this state in testimony given to a military psychiatrist in 1919. You stopped thinking about anything except the next trench. Not the man beside you, not the Germans shooting at you, just the objective. If you started thinking about anything else, you'd freeze. And if you froze, you died, so you just kept moving. This psychological state, later recognized as a form of dissociation, was both the strength and the tragedy of Canadian assault doctrine. It enabled men to do things that conscious thought would have prevented, It also left psychological scars that lasted decades. Canadian veterans had significantly higher rates of what was then called shell shock and would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The doctrine that made them effective in combat made them casualties in peace. The apex of Canadian assault doctrine's terrible effectiveness came during the final months of the war, in battles most people have never heard of. Not Vimy, not Amiens, the small ones, the forgotten ones. The advances that happened too fast to document properly. On 11 November 1918, the morning the armistice was signed, Canadian forces were still advancing. At 0500 hours, the 42nd Battalion, Royal Highlanders of Canada, the Black Watch, launched an assault on the Belgian town of Mons. They weren't supposed to. Orders from British headquarters had indicated a general stand-down in anticipation of the ceasefire scheduled for 11 o'clock hours. But the Canadians had spent 4 years learning that hesitation got you killed. So they kept moving. The battle for Mons lasted 6 hours. Canadian forces cleared the town house by house, street by street, moving through German defensive positions that collapsed not because they were weak but because the Canadians didn't give them time to organize. By 10:45 hours, 15 minutes before the ceasefire took effect, the town was secured. The last Canadian soldier killed in the First World War, Private George Lawrence Price, died at 10:58 hours. Shot by a German sniper during the final push into the town square. 2 minutes before the war ended, the Canadians were still attacking. This wasn't glory. This was the logical conclusion of a doctrine that had trained men to keep moving no matter what. To ignore everything except the objective. To calculate human life in terms of tactical advantage and accept that the moral weight of those calculations was the price of winning. The Germans defending Mons could have held. They had fortified positions, machine gun nests, artillery support. They had every tactical advantage except time. The Canadians didn't give them time. They moved through defensive lines faster than reinforcements could arrive, faster than officers could adjust, faster than men could decide whether to fight or flee. And when it was over, when the last shot was fired and the ceasefire took hold, there were fewer than 60 German prisoners taken during the actual assault. The rest had died fighting, or died running, or died trying to surrender to men who couldn't afford to stop. An American liaison officer, Captain Robert Jackson, 89th Infantry Division, observed the Mons operation from Canadian Corps headquarters. His report, filed on 12 November 1918, contains a single line that captures the entire moral calculus of Canadian assault doctrine. They took the town in 6 hours because they were willing to pay the butcher's bill that stopping would have doubled. That's the truth no memorial acknowledges. The Canadians didn't win faster because they were braver or better trained. They won faster because they accepted a bargain the rest of the Allied armies wouldn't. More blood now, in exchange for less blood later. Higher casualties in a single day rather than grinding losses across weeks. The moral horror of refusing quarter in the moment rather than the accumulated horror of a siege that drags on until the defenders starve. American soldiers watched this and understood why they could never replicate it. Not because American troops lacked courage, because American military culture had a floor beneath which it wouldn't go, a moral threshold it wouldn't cross. The Canadians had learned to operate below that floor, not because they were more savage, but because they'd calculated the cost of staying above it. The final accounting tells the story more clearly than any battle report. Between August and November 1918, the Canadian Corps captured 31,537 German prisoners, 623 artillery pieces, and 3,000 machine guns whilst advancing over 160 kilometers. They did it with a force that started the offensive at 102,000 men and ended it at roughly 85,000 after casualties. The mathematics are brutal. 1 Canadian casualty for every 2 prisoners taken, for every 30 meters of advance, for every hour of sustained offensive operations. Compare that to the Somme, where British and Empire forces suffered 420,000 casualties for 10 kilometers of advance over 141 days. The Canadians advanced 16 times farther in a quarter of the time while suffering a fraction of the casualties. Not because the Germans they faced were weaker, not because the terrain was easier, because they moved faster than the defense could respond, because they accepted tactical brutality to achieve operational humanity, because they understood that on the Western Front, hesitation killed more men than violence. The Canadian Corps was formally disbanded in 1919. Its doctrine was never officially written down. No training manual codified the operational approach that had made it the most feared assault force on the Western Front. But the legacy remained, visible not in documents, but in results. Between April 1917 and November 1918, the Canadian Corps captured more ground, more prisoners, and more artillery pieces than any other Allied formation of comparable size. They did it with a force that never exceeded 4 divisions, roughly 100,000 men at peak strength. They did it whilst suffering casualty rates that would have broken other armies. And they did it by rejecting the foundational assumption of every other military on the Western Front that you could fight humanely and win quickly. American officers who worked alongside the Canadians carried the lessons home, but they carried them quietly. Operational reports praised Canadian effectiveness whilst carefully avoiding the methods that produced it. Staff studies analyzed Canadian tactics without addressing the moral framework that enabled those tactics. And when the U.S. Army revised its assault doctrines in the 1920s and 1930s, it incorporated Canadian innovations in artillery coordination, combined arms integration, and junior officer initiative, whilst studiously ignoring the operational reality that had made those innovations effective. The willingness to keep moving when every instinct and every regulation said to stop. The Canadians themselves rarely spoke about it. Veterans of the Canadian Corps, interviewed decades after the war, described the experience in terms of exhaustion, chaos, and the overwhelming imperative to survive. They didn't frame their actions as moral choices. They described them as operational necessities. You didn't refuse quarter because you were cruel. You refused it because stopping got people killed. Your people. The men beside you. And when the choice was between the enemy's life and your mate's life, there was no choice at all. This is the part history doesn't want to examine too closely. The uncomfortable truth that effectiveness in war and adherence to moral convention sometimes exist in opposition. That the force which inspired both desperate American requests for reinforcement and quiet American horror at their methods was effective precisely because it had learned to operate in the space between military necessity and moral comfort. By the time the Second World War began, the institutional memory of Canadian assault doctrine had faded from official histories but survived in anecdote and reputation. When the 1st Canadian Infantry Division landed in Sicily in July 1943, German intelligence assessments noted that Canadian units advanced with characteristic momentum and limited consolidation. The language was clinical, the meaning was clear. 25 years later, the Germans still remembered. At Ortona in December 1943, at the Gothic Line in 1944, through the Scheldt Estuary in autumn 1944, Canadian forces fought with the same fundamental approach that had defined them in the First World War. High casualties. Rapid advances. Operational results that consistently exceeded what doctrine said was possible, and a quiet understanding, never stated in official reports but acknowledged by every soldier who fought beside them, that the Canadians would take the objective faster than anyone else because they wouldn't let anything slow them down. Not terrain, not weather, not surrender. You can build an army that fights cleanly, or you can build an army that wins quickly. History suggests you rarely get both. The Canadian Corps chose speed. They paid for it with blood, their own and others. And they created a tactical legacy that Allied armies studied, admired, and ultimately refused to replicate because the cost wasn't measured only in casualties. It was measured in the moral weight of decisions made at the edge of a trench, in the 2-second window between seeing hands raised and pulling a trigger, in the operational calculus that treated human life as a variable in an equation where the only constant was forward momentum. The Americans loved them because they delivered results no one else could. The Americans feared them because those results came from a place American military culture couldn't go. Both assessments were correct, and both explain why, more than a century later, the Canadian Corps remains the most effective force you've never been taught to emulate. They didn't take prisoners during the assault because prisoners slowed the assault. It's that simple. And that terrible.